Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious? Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to this podcast review for February the 6th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Brendan, you ready to talk a little M. Night Shyamalan?
No one's ever ready to talk about M. Night Shyamalan.
I think that's very fair. You know you're getting into something of interest with M. Night, for better or worse.
You know there's things to talk about. That's
There's
the
going to
whole
be
point.
something to talk about. Absolutely. Knock at the Cabin is his latest film. That's what we're here to review and discuss. The film did fairly well at the box office.
Yeah.
Finally, someone had to take down Goat Cameron.
It's been 7 weeks.
It's been a long time.
It probably could have done better. I mean, this was still an R-rated film that probably could have gotten a PG-13 rating. We'll talk maybe a little bit about that during the review, but it probably could have done even better numbers if it had that rating associated with it.
Yeah, that is perhaps the case. I am very excited to talk about this one. The discourse is, of course, always interesting when you're talking about M. Night Shyamalan. That is certainly no different here with Knock at the Cabin.
Yeah.
I guess before we get into it, though, I wanted to hear from you your expectations. Did you have any expectations? I don't even know if you saw the trailer. Brendan, for those out there listening or watching that don't know, he loves movie trailers. And by loves, I mean loves.
Love is a very, very specific term.
It is. Did you walk into this film with any sort of expectation, or you just went in blind going, hey, look, this is an M. Night movie. Let's just experience this thing?
It was more the latter. I did see the teaser, which I thought was pretty good. From what I heard, the official trailer that came afterwards was pretty spoiler-filled, if I'm not mistaken. I actually didn't go back and watch it, so I'm not really sure if that really was the case. I've heard a couple people say that, but
Gotcha.
Really the only expectation I had going in was... like thinking about it in the trajectory of this new phase of M. Night Shyamalan. Like,
sure.
We'll talk about this further, but he's got distinct phases in his entire filmography, and this is like a third phase of sorts. This resurgence of sorts, where his movies have been really dividing people. And that's really the only expectation I had, was expecting something that would get people talking. That's simply it.
Well, it's got people talking.
So I was right.
For sure. And we're here to talk about it. This film, speaking of Knock at the Cabin, it is, of course, written and directed by M. Night Shyamalan. Steve Desmond and Michael Sherman are attached to this screenplay as well. It stars Dave Bautista, Jonathan Groff, Ben Aldridge, Kristen Sue, Nikki Amuka Bird, Abby Quinn, Rupert Grint, with an appearance in this film. I'm excited to talk about him as well. If you're not familiar with Knock at the Cabin, while vacationing, a girl and her parents are taken hostage by armed strangers who demand that the family make a choice to avert the apocalypse. So, a small premise, as always, within my Shyamalan.
We'll have thoughts about that.
Oh, yes, we certainly do have some thoughts. So I guess let's go ahead and jump into this. Brendan, what did you think about Knock at the Cabin?
It is also worth noting that this is based on a novel by Paul Tremblay, I believe. The novel is
Which I haven't read.
I have not read either. It is called Cabin at the End of the World. It came out in 2018. And I have heard that much of the first half of this film is pretty faithful to the book until it starts to formulate its own path as it goes. And
Sure.
I think that's why M. Night even chose to call this movie Knock at the Cabin as opposed to Cabin at the End of the World. So that way it does
because it's not
have
a direct.
it
make
has
of the
this
movie
own
or of the
identity
book.
to it. I mean, because to be perfectly honest, I think Cabin at the End of the World is a better title. But I understand that this is meant to almost be its own entity. It's meant to be a Shyamalan entity and not a Paul Tremblay entity here. And of course, it's a Shyamalan movie. And given this new phase of Shyamalan that we're talking about, it's got people talking. It's got people talking.
Got people talking.
In a weird way. And this might almost sound a bit hypocritical from my point of view, because after the wild swings that M. Night has taken with movies like Old and Glass and The Visit, which sort of kickstarted this new phase.
Mhm.
I do think it's interesting to see M. Night operating with a little bit more restraint this time around. Now,
Yeah.
I didn't say subtlety. I didn't say nuance. Those are big differences. I said restraint, and that's
Uh-huh.
mostly referring to his filmmaking here and the overall.
Mhm.
There actually is a smallness to this film when compared to the movies that preceded it. It's not as bold in the same ways. It's bold in a very different way, which we'll certainly talk about.
Mhm.
I guess because of that smallness, I would say this is probably the tightest and most efficient film that he has made in probably over a decade. Um, do I think it's his best film over the past decade as well? I don't know about that.
Okay.
I need to wait and see if time will be kind to it, at least with my relationship with it, because
Okay.
part of my reservation right now is that I've just come to love the boldness and the I don't give a shit attitude of films like Glass and Old, which are films that
Yeah.
they're not perfect. In fact, there are
Yeah.
many problems with those movies, but I still find myself thinking about them a lot.
Fair. Yeah.
I think Knock at the Cabin has a little less of that boldness. It's really meant to be more of a singular and maybe even an emotive experience. Now, there is a boldness here that we will talk about. It's mostly regarding its theological and even political and social themes. Maybe not necessarily in the themes themselves, but more so in the way Shyamalan chooses to depict them and how they're funneled through, let's just say, the orientation of certain characters. I think there's a boldness there that maybe we can offer up our thoughts on. I think it's a very tight and efficient film that maybe has more callbacks to the early days of Shyamalan, so there's maybe a little bit of nostalgia there. But I don't know. I need to sit with this one for a bit to see how well it holds up. I'm wondering if I'll think about it as much as I have some of the other ones, and I've come to really respect the daring narrative choices he took us on in those previous
Mhm.
films, which uh, this one has in smaller doses. It's certainly more efficient, which I give it credit for. But I don't know. Maybe this conversation will be an interesting one to see where I
Yeah.
end up landing on things.
Well, like you, this is a film that I do need to wrestle with. I'm not sure where it ranks for me with M. Night, but I did
Right.
really like it. Certainly
Okay.
more than you, it sounds. In fact, it may be my favorite of his family excursions that go really horrible trilogy that we've gotten in the last few years. Although I need to rewatch Old to confirm that. Either way,
Yeah.
this film is his best directed of not just his post comeback career, but maybe since The Village in 2004. With all due respect to
Yeah.
Split and perhaps Old, which are good movies, Split is arguably the best overall movie of this current era that we're in with M. Night. But I absolutely love the camera work and editing of this film. The
Yeah.
extreme close ups
Yeah.
we see early on with Leonard and Wen are really fantastic. Somehow they create both nervous unease and this tender earnestness. It creates great ambiguity as to Leonard's true intentions and how pure they really are. And that's just one example. M. Night emphasizes those close ups constantly throughout the film. Jonathan Groff has a few that offer up great ambiguity as
Yeah.
well.
Sure.
Or how about Rupert Grint, eh? His performance here is really great. It's a far cry from Ron Weasley.
Yeah.
As
And
someone,
it's a very it's a brief performance, we'll simply say, but it really does leave an impact.
it does. He embodies anger and menace in ways that are very convincing. But again, there are some great close ups of Redmond when he begins to act on why he's in this cabin to begin with, I'll say vaguely, and the
Yeah.
fear and urgency in his eyes and in his overall demeanor is palpable. It's really quite visceral. Grant is so great in the moment performatively, but it's also in how M. Night heightens it with his camera work and his editing because it's not just the framing and the close-ups. I also love that M. Night isn't interested in over violence, and this circles back to that restraint that you're talking about.
Yeah.
We do see some of it, but most of the violence here is hidden from us, and I think that's a deliberate choice as the film is trying to be more than just a conventional genre exercise. Now, whether it works thematically or not, that can be debated. We'll do our best to get into that. But I love that approach stylistically. But perhaps most notably, he finally did the thing, Brendan. We all knew this would happen one day. And maybe this is a little bit of a spoiler, but again, with people talking, we kind of know.
Spoilers here. I feel like we kind of need to talk about certain things. Maybe at a certain point, we'll get into spoilers.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe this is a little bit of a mild spoiler, although, again, it's out there. People have been talking about this on social media.
Yeah.
But I do love how we've been anticipating, at least I feel like many of us have been anticipating that this would happen one day, and it's finally here. The big twist at the end of this film is that there is no twist. He finally played that card. How M. Night Shyamalan to build up these expectations over a decade, 15, 20 years of making movies.
Yeah.
And the twist is there is no twist. I bet you didn't see that coming, Brendan.
I don't know. I in a way, I think just given the trajectory of how he was telling the story, I wasn't surprised that there really wasn't a twist. Where I'm still wrestling with this movie, and maybe this is something we can talk about, is there meant to be some lingering ambiguity by the end? Or are we meant to take this kind of literal? I feel like there is... I feel like M. Night is choosing a slight side as in relation to the what of it all, you know, like whether there is or was truth in Leonard and his posse's beliefs and actions. And I do think the film more or less implies that they were right. But I also think there are some lingering uncertainties with regard to how certain characters and their perspectives choose to interpret it. And I think that's where I think the movie's kind of interesting. That's where I've heard a lot of think pieces on the film and why it has perhaps offended a lot of people, given the fact that it depicts a gay couple at front and center, and the ramifications of that relationship as far as how it relates back to their own families and whatnot. That actually is part of the story. It is a plot point, and it is kind of addressed. And I think given that perspective, it maybe does create a little bit of ambiguity, but I do feel like there's more evidence to suggest that whether you want to call this supernatural or godlike, that something was indeed happening. No, not the happening. Something was happening beyond just
maybe it was
human
also
level.
the happening.
Maybe it was the Maybe the trees did it.
It was the trees. And so, you know, they were in the woods after
They
all.
were in the woods.
So.
Oh, man, yeah. Those
It's a connected
northeastern
universe.
trees,
That's what we're saying here.
The Philadelphia saga continues to kill people.
So here's where I find the film really fascinating in regards to the idea that this film doesn't have any sort of patented M. Night twist. When you couple that with the extreme discourse we see these days regarding religious fanaticism, which is certainly a part of this movie, and then you tether that with the fact that our protagonist here, as you just noted there, they are a gay couple, which fundamentally contradicts religious ethos, at least with Christianity. I can't speak for any other religions. And you would think this was prime for some sort of sleight of hand. Instead, while Andrew speaks to modern psychology and internet groupthink and how that compelled these four individuals to connect and meet at this cabin, a lot of what he theorizes makes sense. It's a logical explanation that could have rendered this film another The Village, if you will.
It kind of started to remind me of that one scene in Glass, almost like the Sarah Paulson of it all, where for a brief moment I started to believe the logistical side of things, that maybe there wasn't anything beyond the human experience happening here. And I think Andrew does make some valid observations there.
He does. And what's interesting, though, instead of using that for any sort of sleight of hand, what M. Night does instead is he gives credence to that religious fanaticism.
Yeah.
And I find that interestingly provocative. That on its own terms is very compelling to me, especially because it is often associated with delusion or manipulation. That is religious fanaticism. So our expectation would be that at some point M. Night would pull the rug out from under us.
Yeah.
And he knows that, not only because of the subject matter, but because it's M. Night and we're expecting some sort of reveal. So what does he do? He plays into that by letting religious fanaticism have a foundational truth to it in this film. Again, I find that provocative. Now, here's where things get all the more captivating to me.
Okay.
There is a twist to this film.
Oh,
I
now
don't know
I
if
need
it's
to hear
being
this.
talked about enough, or perhaps I just have missed it. But there is this fascinating twist here, and it might be more indicative of the source material. Again, I haven't read it. But
Yeah.
when you consider something like Christianity, for example, where salvation is rooted in the purity of Jesus, according to the text, his unconditional love and innocence became the path forward for hope. And how is that symbolically represented here? It is in a gay couple whose love for each other is just as pure and innocent, which again is wholly contradictory to Christian fundamentalism.
True.
That
It's
is
interesting
unbelievable
movie-
to
it's
me, the
interesting
way
that
it's
the
depicted here.
It's interesting that the movie is kind of contradicting itself in a way that seems like it's doing it on purpose. Like I feel like this is M. Night trying to have his cake and eat it too, and he's also doing it further by giving the character of Andrew, played by Ben Aldrich here, a very specific history, a very specific encounter that he had at a bar, we'll simply say.
Yeah.
And one can maybe argue that that maybe clouds his judgment a little bit. Maybe
Sure.
that makes his viewpoint a little, I don't want to say less valid, but a bit biased, we'll simply say. So maybe that does change the way you view that character's credibility, adding even further complications and a murkiness to the way that this story could be perceived by the end, which is why, while I do think the film does pick more of a side on the theological elements of it, in a way, by doing so, it's also not. And I feel like in any other movie, that's a problem. Like I could easily criticize a movie for not being able to, stick to its guns, but somehow I think that's what makes the ending so provocative here, and why
Yeah.
I love thinking about it in the way that you're talking about too.
Well, you hesitated to use the word subtlety earlier and
Yeah.
nuance. And this is where I will be a little less restrained in that
Okay.
regard. I think because of that approach, and again, some of this might be the source material, but I haven't read it, so I don't know where he detours from the source material in this regard.
I have heard what the ending is in the book. It's vastly different. I can see
Yeah.
why he chose not to go this way, because it is severely devastating, and in a way that I could see it rubbing people the wrong way, especially during our times. I'll simply say that.
Yeah. And I do think that he does a good job of offering up some sophistication within the character dynamics at play, such as
Sure.
what you were just talking about there with Andrew or with Dave Bautista's character. And I certainly want to talk about him here in a moment. But on its own terms, separated from the novel, because again, I haven't read it.
Yeah.
But I do find it really fascinating because you said that the film might lean one way versus another in terms of its philosophy or its politics
Yeah.
or religion. I don't know if it does, or at least I think there's more ambiguity here than maybe what the film is getting credit for.
I think underneath, I think if you're only looking at the quote unquote what of it all, like if you're going into this film hoping to hold on to strictly the mystery as to whether this was all happening or not, you might get more of an answer that you're
I
looking
don't think
for.
there's ambiguity there.
Well, that's where I say there's no subtlety or no nuance, because it's only in the what. But weirdly, as we're talking about, somehow by being less subtle with that, it creates different subtleties somewhere else. As we're talking about.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
The what as to how it plays out, I don't know if that needed to have any sort of ambiguity, but the choice to have it play out that way, again, there's no dramatic or narrative twist, a traditional M. Night reveal, if you will. It plays out pretty straightforwardly.
Yeah.
But by doing that, again, the film gives credence to religious fanaticism. And
Yeah.
I can see how that would rub people the wrong
Yeah.
way, given that our central protagonists here are a gay couple. But
Yeah.
again, I don't think that's accidental, because where it becomes more subtle, more introspective. I don't think this lies there on the surface, but where that subversiveness is so captivating to me is that the film channels that religious fanaticism to comment on what is pure love. What does that look like, especially when
What
you
does
consider
Christianity teach us that we sometimes
Exactly.
lose? Like, what's the theme? What's the moral that we take away from? And why shouldn't that apply to a couple at the center of this movie like this?
which contradicts religion, or at least Christian fundamentalism.
Yeah.
That to me is really, really compelling.
I think M. Night is really trying to get us to have a dialogue about these things. In a weird way, I was kind of reminded of recently Darren Aronofsky's The Whale, which isn't really doing the same thing. Like, but I think as we talked about with that review some weeks ago, maybe months ago, depending on when that time was, we felt like that movie was trying to initiate a dialogue on the difference between addiction and fat phobia. Whereas here, maybe religion and homophobia is now trying to join the conversation in a way. And I think that's what M. Night is trying to do. I don't know if he's 100% successful in all of that, but I think there is an interesting way that he chooses to tell that story by being very literal with certain things and how that literalness creates subtlety and nuance that I'm wondering if that was intentional, because if it was, that's kind of brilliant.
Well, and that's where I'm starting to lean with this film, at least in terms of its philosophy, with its thematic nucleus. Is it perhaps a little disjointed in execution? Could it have wrestled with these things a little bit further? Now, those are arguments I'm willing to listen to. I don't know if the film fully comes together in the end. As I noted, I still have to wrestle with it, but I do think that this film is one of his most ambitious because of how he is trying to subvert Christian fundamentalism, which is such a significant part of our culture. It has a stronghold on American politics, on our social dynamics. And you think about how old school the mentality is in that regard.
Yeah.
How the LGBTQ community is still having to fight this incredible uphill battle all the time because of the stronghold that fundamentalism has in our country with those in power, if you will. But not even those in power. You go on TikTok or Twitter or social media, YouTube, you don't have to scroll very far to understand that when it comes to that topic, there's a dividing line in our country.
Yeah, that's fair.
And there's a great irony that when you look at the biblical text, what Jesus's purpose was in terms of his sacrifices and how it comes from this place of purity and love, and what M. Night is doing in this film.
Individuality, it was all about those things. Yeah.
And who is the Christ-like figures of this film? Well, it's not the individuals that you would associate with traditional Christian fundamentalism. It is the opposite. And again, I find that fascinating. To me, that's where the bold qualities of this film lie. And it's not overt in a typical M. Night way, which is also why I think I'm so drawn to this film. And then you couple that with his more restrained filmmaking, as we were talking about earlier. And all of a sudden, what seems like this quiet, untypical M. Night straightforward narrative on the surface, there's so much more happening mechanically and thematically underneath that I did not expect, but I loved.
I think part of why it works in that way too, and this is something we haven't even addressed yet, at least you alluded to it a little bit by talking about Dave Bautista. I think why those nuances and subtleties are ultimately there, I think a lot of it is really due to how great of a performative piece that this is. If you look at the
performances are great.
The trajectory of Shyamalan, just his entire filmography, he's normally good at getting decent performances, at least, even in some of his worst movies. I mean, a movie like Lady in the Water, I don't care for all that much, but that one scene with Paul Giamatti and the healing scene, he starts talking about his children. It's devastating because of his performance. Everyone in this movie, Knock at the Cabin, is giving a great performance. I think
this is the best ensemble cast or performance anyway since The Village. I would say
I think it might be like top 3 M. Night
it's up there.
performed movies of his.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people are talking about Dave Bautista and him giving a career best performance, and yeah, it's because he's so good at playing against type when he gives more of a quiet, almost gentle giant like performance. I love his brief cameo in Blade Runner 2049, and more or less he's doing some of the same things here, but I mean, that's not to discredit everyone else, because everyone else is really selling this material in a way that I don't think many other films of M. Night's as of late have done. You know, as much as I talk about Old and being a very bold and ambitious movie, the performances are really good in that movie, but that's not what makes that movie great. In this case, the performances are really supporting everything that we're talking about here.
Yeah, they're all really great, and we can certainly get into them. But I noted earlier Dave Bautista.
Yeah.
And wow, what an incredible performance. He is so good here. Everyone is great as we're talking about, but he probably is the standout for me. There's something about the melancholy and sorrow that he embodies that I just think is phenomenal. And it starts in that opening scene, which I think is really great.
Yeah.
We get the symbolism of the grasshoppers trapped inside the jar, which might be a little obvious.
A little direct, yeah.
A little direct. I still like it nonetheless. But then we see that dynamic between Leonard and Wen, and there's something about the imposing juxtaposition between this little girl and Dave Bautista, who is obviously very large and physically intimidating. That should invoke fear and trepidation, but it doesn't.
My first thought with that was, man, this guy is good with kids. I bet he's a teacher or something like that. And of course, look what happens.
A lot of it comes down to that surprising, gentle quality in Leonard. He knows what is about to take place, and he's aware of how arduous it will be for Ren and her fathers. My heart is broken because of what I have to do today, is what he tells little Wen there.
Could be a silly line, but you buy it. You absolutely buy it here.
Just the gentle warmth that he says that line with, and you can't help but be drawn to the character. And it sets the tone impeccably for what we're about to see and how both M. Night and this material approaches suspense, because, again, there's this subversive nature to it that I quite loved. And as much as it is M. Night in a storytelling and in that restrained approach, these performances tap into that in such a great way. And it starts with Dave Bautista as the de facto leader of that group. And I think he leads them in this really elegant way that I don't know if I anticipated, but man, an incredible performance.
It's something you don't normally see in home invasion movies like this, is the emphasis on the invaders really not wanting to be there.
They didn't want to be there.
They feel bad about this, and you don't just sense that with Dave Bautista. We also have Nikki Amuka Bird and Abby Quinn. Rupert Grint is certainly part of that, but he's certainly the hothead of the group. So
there's a reason for that.
There is
that
a
is
reason
given at
for
the
that.
end of the film.
Yep, there's a reason for that. But as far as the other two women here that are joined in this group of 4 that invade this cabin, you get a genuine sense that none of them want to be there. They feel genuine fear, not just for the ramifications of what will happen if this deed is not carried out and what they believe in, but fear for the people that they may have to harm and inflict, mental and theological pain on. And you don't see that very often in home invasion movies like this.
I agree. I think of that moment that Sabrina has there with Eric. It wasn't Andrew. It had to have been Eric, right? Because
Eric's the one played by Jonathan Groff who suffered the concussion.
Yeah. So it's Sabrina and Eric in this bathroom, and she is taking care of him because of said concussion. So we're seeing her treat him with empathy. She has a medical background, I'll say vaguely, and so she's able to help him there. But then she also has a conversation about the broader picture of what's happening. And similarly to what we see with Leonard, there isn't a sense of I'm trying to invoke fear or I'm after these individuals. If anything, it's the opposite. She, like Leonard, empathizes with them, and she is simply trying to get him to understand the significance of why they're there, of why they have to do these things, even if she doesn't want to. And yeah, that dynamic is really great. So it certainly comes through
Yeah.
in all these performances. But Amuka Bird, yeah, she's
It's
great.
certainly more thrilling to see people doing bad things because they don't want to, which is a weird thing to say about it, but that's more or less what happens here.
Absolutely. Or as I noted in my opening thoughts with Redmond, even
Mhm.
though he is abrasive, there is something about how that in and of itself is subverted when that character is about to be crystallized. I'll say as vaguely as I can, because
Yeah, it's
again, you think
yeah.
about the emotion, the fear, the importance of what he's doing. He is almost like a different character in those final moments.
Mhm.
And man, that performance, as brief as it is, I think has layers to it. And man, I don't know if I've seen that from Rupert Grint before, but I
Yeah.
really enjoyed it.
It's a small shot, and there's a wordless moment. It's kind of a wordless moment, but he has a reaction that completely changes the entire trajectory of that character, at least how he was initially set up. And for a character you felt so much fear and almost hatred for, you kind of feel bad for in the moment then. And
Absolutely.
and I found that interesting. The way that that character crystallizes, there are some frightening shots there. Kind of hidden. I like the way that you said that some of the violence, in fact, really all the violence is done off screen.
Yeah.
I need to ask, like, was there really a reason for this to get an R rating?
Mm,
I mean, there are a couple F words here. I think it
yeah.
might
That might be
exceed
it. Yeah.
the PG-13 limit if there is a mathematical equation for that. But aside from that, as far as the violence here, it's not that bad. I've seen
I
worse
agree.
in other PG-13 movies.
I agree. I mean, perhaps it could be some of the tone and the dread of it all. But in terms of the
Yeah,
violence, it's mostly off screen, other than there's one wound that is shown as we near the third act of the film, I'll say vaguely. But most of the violence outside of that one wound as a character rushes into the cabin, it all takes place off screen.
yeah.
And I do love that because again, it's not about the violence.
It isn't. You're right.
And it's more so why these characters are there, how it relates to belief systems, how it relates to
Yeah,
religious fanaticism, and then ultimately how the film gives that credence.
yeah.
There is a truth to it all.
And maybe that's partially why we have seen movies earn maybe harsher ratings because of topicality reasons. And I do sometimes feel like that's a
Mhm.
little unfortunate, as if to suggest that younger
Yeah,
audiences can't deal with this kind of stuff yet. I think it's not really fair for the MPAA to make those choices
I
sometimes.
agree. Yeah.
But because I look at this movie and compare it to something like Old or even The Visit, for instance. Those movies are way more sinister. There are more disturbing images in those movies. Heck, some of the violence in Old is way more violent, at least from what we see. I mean, the whole
Sure.
calcium sequence in
Yeah.
Old puts any of the violence in this movie to shame, and yet
Yeah.
both of those movies earn PG-13 ratings. And you're right, maybe it does come down to tone. Those movies were a bit more tongue in cheek, I guess you can
Yeah.
say. Whereas within this new phase of M. Night Shyamalan, Knock at the Cabin is certainly the most self-serious and perhaps the one that earns that. I think
Mhm.
this is the one that is meant to be taken a little bit more seriously. It's not. I mean, there are a few jokes here that I did laugh at, but it's not as goofily funny or maybe inadvertently funny as some of those other
Yeah.
movies are.
No, there is a dolefulness to this film,
Yeah,
but I am with you that in terms of unsettling horror, this is the most tepid of his films
sure.
in this new era.
Yeah,
Even The Visit, I think, has more of a harrowing presence, especially in its final act, than what this film has. This film is less about its approach to suspense. As I
mhm,
noted, the film goes out of its way to subvert it whenever it can. Now, it is also a movie, and it is trying to act as a movie, and therefore there is some suspense. But when that catharsis is supposed to come, instead of indulging in it, which M.
mhm.
Night is no stranger to doing,
Yeah,
in this film, he shows restraint because it's not about cheap thrill. It's not about
It's not about spinning the
violence.
camera like he did in Old. I mean, he was playing with the camera like a
Yeah.
like a toddler with a new toy in that movie. And
I mean, the
and
way
that's
he
what made that
uses
movie
the-
fun, though.
I agree. I don't disagree.
Yeah.
What he does with the camera here is less for fun's sake, and it's more so about heightening that emotion and heightening character dynamic, right? I mean, we mentioned the close-ups of this film, and those are done with purpose.
But even when the camera is on top of, let's say, Rupert Grint's head as he's getting the crap beaten out of him, which could have seemed like a quote unquote fun and interesting shot composition,
Sure.
there's actually something kind of visceral about it. Like, and maybe it's because of the way it's the way we hear that, the way it's sound, the way the sound
Yeah.
is mixed and edited there, maybe has a point there too.
Yeah.
But even some of the trickery here, it's done in a way that doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like it's done with the same purpose as something like Old, for instance,
Yeah.
which was very playful, literally playful. And
Yeah.
this is not really that.
Yeah, I think in not just M. Night films,
Mhm.
but in a lot of horror films, there's always something sinister that is driving the drama and suspense. What's interesting about that here is that these characters want nothing to do with violence. They
Yeah.
want to avoid it, if anything, avoid it at all costs. They beg, they plead, they try to empathize. But when you're not just in this, you're tied to a chair and your partner is there, your husband in this case,
Yeah.
and also your daughter is there. Of course, they're going to react out of fear. They're going to buy into that, the notion that these are just crazy fundamentalists of some kind. So that initial ambiguity is certainly, you can understand the mentality there. You can
Sure.
understand where
Sure.
they're coming from. But what's interesting with our four invaders, they really, truly want nothing to do with violence. They want to avoid it at all costs, which is what is so heartbreaking about Adrian's plea,
Yeah.
where she brings up her son even in this heartbreaking way. But again, the way it's performed, the way it's staged by M. Night, you think about the reaction
Yeah.
of the two actors in the chair and Wen as well. And there is this lingering uncertainty as if she's telling the truth or not. But as we come to find out,
Yeah.
there is credence to everything they're doing. And you think back going, yeah, she was trying to avoid that in any way possible.
Which is what
Everything
makes
was
it
true about
that's what makes it so appropriate that when there is violence in the film, very bloody violence, we don't really see much of it because
Exactly.
It's as if to say, because these characters don't want to partake in it, M.
Neither are
Night
we.
doesn't want us to be exposed to
Yeah.
it either, which I love that
Exactly.
choice. I think it's a
I
great
agree.
choice.
I agree. So the more I think
I'm
about
liking this
film,
movie a lot more, which is kind of what I expected to happen.
Yeah.
I feel like that has happened a lot within this new phase of M. Night. I remember when
Yeah.
we talked about Old, when that film first came out on that whatever episode that was, I went as far as to say that the ending of that film is M. Night's worst ending, but I still think about it. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
might have to eat those words because of that.
Yeah.
And I think I might be thinking about this movie in different ways. And a lot of it is not just because of what we talked about, but it's very artfully crafted. You
I
know,
agree.
In this phase of M. Night, this is his best performed and best crafted film, probably his best looking film since The Village. I would say.
I agree. I think it might not be his best overall movie since The Village, but I do think it's the best performed and the best
Yeah.
directed film of his since then.
Yeah,
And-
I might have a soft spot still for Glass within this new era because it just took me by complete surprise. I mean,
Okay.
it's less as a movie when compared to this, but more as an experience, if that makes sense.
That's
but
fair.
I think this is definitely the most efficient and well
Mm-hmm.
crafted of the bunch thus far.
I agree. And the subtle texture of this film, I don't know if I anticipated. And it's why I want to go back and revisit something like Old, which is
Yeah.
a film I liked, didn't love at the time. But I kind of wonder if similarly to my experience here, maybe maybe there's something I was missing that first go around.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to revisit that one and see if it
I want to.
lingers
Yeah.
with me more.
I want to revisit all of these. I didn't get a chance to revisit, for lack of a better term, revisit The Visit, which, as you remember, I almost called that my least favorite Shyamalan film when that first came out. And
Yeah.
I think my tune on that one has changed. I think as I've gotten older, I might come to respect the nastiness of that movie. That's a
Sure.
mean movie. The Visit is a very mean movie in the
Mhm.
way it plays with this devastating scenario with a weird tinge of like sinister comedy, at least I felt
Mhm.
like. And maybe as I've gotten older, I'm gonna come to respect that one more. So I need to give that one another
Yeah,
go. But I
same.
feel like
Yeah.
this whole phase of Shyamalan has just been so fascinating.
It's been very interesting. As we
Yeah.
noted at the very top of this,
Yeah.
at the very least, it fosters conversation.
For sure.
All right, let's get to final thoughts. Brendan, do you have any concluding thoughts here on Knock at the Cabin?
We talked a lot about how good this film looks. The two of the big MVPs we have to single out here are the two cinematographers tied to this movie. One of them being Lowell A. Meyer, and the other one being a cinematographer that we've loved many times on this podcast. He's been mentioned during our award shows a few times, and that's Jaron Blanchke, who normally works with Robert Eggers, of all directors. And this film looks it looks great. It really does. It doesn't look like it's carrying the low budget that M. Night did this deal with Universal for this 2-picture deal. It looks awesome. So I just wanted to single out those two names as well, that the film is very artfully crafted, and the two of them are a huge reason for it. So yeah, I'm not sure where this ranks in Shyamalan's entire filmography for me yet. Within this new phase, my favorite might still be Glass, but I feel like these 5 films that have come out so far since The Visit onward, I wouldn't be surprised if the ranking changes like every single day, because that's just they all offer their own thing, and none of them feel like the same thing. None of them feel like they came from the same mind sometimes. But I love this new attitude of Shyamalan's, and that's I think a lot of people are responding to it as well.
Yeah, I very much responded to this one. As I just noted a moment ago, I really do want to revisit old, maybe The Visit as well. There is an argument to be made that Split is maybe the best of this current era.
Yeah, see, right now that might be my least favorite of the 5.
See, I think it's more of a conventional thriller, but I think it's
maybe
done
that's why.
really well, and I think it has one of my favorite M. Night twists in it, because none of us went into that film expecting it to tie into the Unbreakable universe, if you will.
Yeah.
And just as a thriller, the performances, that's another really well performed movie.
Sure.
That I think there's an argument to be made that just in terms of dotting I's and crossing T's from maybe more consistently.
Yeah.
But that said, I do much prefer Knock at the Cabin to something like Split or Glass. And I think a lot of it comes down to, again, the restraint in his filmmaking here, the empathy in these performers. You have a scenario in which dread and tension is at the core, at the nucleus of the drama, yet none of these characters want anything to do with that dread. They want nothing to do with the violence. I love that irony. I love how M. Night plays with it. And as I noted, the subtle twist that actually is here, there's not a narrative or dramatic twist, but this thematic twist, this irony, if you will, of who the Jesus-like figures are here and how that contradicts so much of what America represents in terms of, Christian fundamentalism. I find that provocative. That's really interesting. And I could see a lot of people being taken aback by this movie in that regard. I can't speak to how it depicts the gay couple, obviously. So I won't get into that. I'll just simply reiterate that if people have a problem with it, I think that's perfectly fair.
Right.
But what I love about the depiction of those characters here, again, how it tethers to the religious fanaticism. That to me is where I think its strengths are, and really what the purpose of them as a gay couple here is mostly anyway.
Yeah.
I would think. At least that's where it works for me the most. So
it works as an emotive piece for me as well. I think the way this film concludes, the final scene is kind of pitch perfect, honestly. I don't want to give too much away, but it involves a needle drop that is pretty well done.
Again, and coming from an outside perspective, admittedly that worked for me as well. Like the dynamic between Groff and Aldridge, I think, is fantastic. You certainly feel that relationship, the purity. And I do think that is important because ultimately they have to embody a pure love in order for any of it to make sense and work thematically.
Right.
And I think they do a great job of embodying that and making that romanticism, that love they have for each other seem unbreakable, pun intended. No, very pun intended.
Oh, man, don't say something like that when I'm taking a sip of my drink, man. Oh, God.
And so, I love that about this film. And I think they do a great job of making that work. And, of course, the dynamic they have with Wen, played wonderfully by Kristen Sue. I know we haven't talked about her too much, but she's fantastic as well.
Her first film, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big fan. My only question with M. Night moving forward is, and I know he's working with a more limited budget these days, but what do we have to do to get James Newton Howard back on board the M. Night train?
I don't know.
That's what I want to know.
I mean, his scores for these movies haven't been bad, but I mean, James Newton Howard is one of the GOATs. So it's I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they do work together again.
Please. I'm begging at this point.
Yeah.
I want it.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe someday.
And I'm with you. The scores to these films, they're not bad. They're complimentary. They work fine. They're not nearly as memorable though.
Right.
And I think there's something about the music of The Village or Unbreakable or, even Avatar, The Last Airbender. That is a terrible movie with a really great score. That film does not deserve that score. It is so good.
It doesn't deserve a lot of things, and that score is certainly one of them.
At any rate, I'll have more thoughts with this film on Letterboxd. If you want to continue this conversation, go ahead and hit us up there at letterboxd.com/InSessionFilm. Brendan, are you a coffee drinker?
You like coffee? Know it. I feel like in this profession, we need to be coffee drinkers. It's kind of a requirement.
It's a requirement, especially if you have kids, because they drain the life out of you. And
I can't relate to that notion yet, but I too am an active coffee drinker. I know you are as well.
Absolutely. And that's why we need to talk about Coffee Cult, because Coffee Cult sources only specialty grade Arabica coffee beans from over 50 countries around the world.
Yeah.
They inspect each bean and only select the highest grade. So the quality is unmatched. They are making the Ferraris of coffee.
It's ethically sourced, and it also tastes really good. And for those of us, we love our coffee. It's all about that taste. It needs to taste a certain way, and this one does.
And what's also great is they roast to order. So they don't just roast a bunch of coffee and it's sitting in some warehouse and they just send you what happens to be sitting there. No.
Yes.
They wait for your order to come in. It is roasted and then shipped to you within a few days.
Yes.
So when it arrives at your house, it is incredibly fresh.
Yes.
It is the freshest coffee you can have.
It's so fresh, and it's convenient to you as the consumer of coffee.
Yes.
But what's great about this platform is that it only sources coffee from farms that actually pay its workers, and especially women, and it pays them all fairly and equally. So it goes back into how ethically
that's a big part of it.
This product is.
Absolutely. Ethically sourced, only selecting the highest grade possible. So again, we're talking about the Ferraris of coffee. We're not talking about low grade coffee.
Everyone wants a Ferrari.
Exactly. So this coffee, it tastes great. They have single origin coffees available, various blends for you to try, and you can get 15% off with our code. So if you go to coffeecult.com, select your great Ferrari coffee.
Yes.
At checkout, use the code ISF. That is code ISF. Get 15% off. This is the best coffee you will ever try.
Yeah.
It is fantastic. The Sumatra is one of my favorites. The Brazil, also very, very, very good.
Oh man, I'm thirsty now, man. You can't do this late for me.
I know. If it wasn't so late, I'd be drinking as we're doing this. But at some point, I got to sleep tonight.
Yeah.
But it's really great. Go check them out again. That's coffeecult.com. At checkout, use the code ISF and get 15% off.
And if you agree or disagree with what we just had to say about M. Night Shyamalan's Knock at the Cabin, provoking even more conversation from y'all out there, you can let us know your thoughts on either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can find us at In Session Film. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/In Session Film, or email us your thoughts in long form at insessionfilm@gmail.com.
All right, that'll do it for our review of Knock at the Cabin. M. Night Shyamalan is back. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. Would be curious to hear everyone's thoughts out there. So,
Yep.
With that, Brennan Cassidy, JD Duran, we will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Go M. Night!
James Newton Howard rules.